All right. So if your previous R01 received a score, but it's not quite in the fundable range, how can you make sure that it gets funded on your resubmission? That's what we're talking about today. If you're new around here, my name is Sarah Dobson. My team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So, today I'm going to walk you through the three major steps that you need to take on to ensure that your R01 resubmission gets funded. And these are the steps that we take our clients through when we work with them one on one inside our strategic grant reviews. So, number one, the very first thing you need to do is do a deep dive into your summary statement. You really want to make sure that you understand as best you can what the reviewers are asking for, what they're really saying in their critiques. And of course, there are going to be a lot of obvious critiques. But what we notice more often than not is that there are also some not so obvious critiques, and you kind of have to read between the lines of your summary statement to figure out what it is that the reviewers are asking you. The biggest difference between what is obvious and what is not obvious is to do with the critiques around scientific merit, which are usually pretty obvious, and the ones around grantsmanship, which are less obvious. And the reason that the critiques around grantsmanship are less obvious is because that's not what the reviewers are there to critique you on. They are there to assess the scientific and technical merit of your grant proposal. But if your grantsmanship is not great, they are not going to be able to do their jobs. They're not going to be able to assess the grants. They're not going to be able to assess the scientific merit. And so you'll end up with these kind of cryptic critiques that you don't really understand that usually point to an issue with grantsmanship. But because the reviewers aren't trained to critique your grantsmanship, it can sometimes be a little bit hard to tell what it is that they're getting at. So that's just to explain the difference between the obvious and not so obvious critiques that you get. But in that first step where you're doing a deep dive in your summary statement, you want to make sure that you come out of that with a really clear plan, a really clear idea of what your next steps are. And one of the best ways to do that, and again, what we do with our clients inside our strategic grant review, is that we go through the summary statement essentially line by line, critique by critique, and we ask our PIs, do you agree with this critique or not? And either way, we get really useful information. If our PI agrees with the critiques, then they already know what they have to do to respond to that. But if they disagree, we also get really useful information about what needs to show up in the resubmission in terms of the justification for why you're doing things the way that you're doing them, why you might be disagreeing with your reviewers around a particular aspect of your proposal. Generally speaking, it just means that that part isn't so clear. And so your job in your resubmission is to make sure that that is abundantly clear to your reviewers. So that's stage number one. That's the first thing that you need to do to really ensure that your resubmission is in a fundable position, right? The next, of course, is to actually sort of execute that plan that you have created through the deep dive into your summary statement. And I kind of break these up into two different parts. The first is addressing the scientific merit, addressing the critiques around the scientific merit, right? So that, of course, is usually related to critiques of your approach. And so this may involve, depending on what sort of critiques you got in your summary statement, this might mean, going back and generating more preliminary data to bolster some of your arguments around your different aims that you've created. It might mean, ensuring that you have built out your argument a little more clearly in in how you arrived at your central hypothesis, that kind of thing. So you might need to do some work there to enhance the scientific merit. You might also need to adjust some of your experiments, for example. There are lots of different things that you can do to enhance the scientific merit of your application as it relates to the critiques on your approach. And those are obviously going to be pretty clear, pretty obvious, pretty specific based on what your reviewers have told you in your summary statement. But next, that you need to pay attention to is the critiques of your significance and innovation as it relates to scientific merit. So it might not just be cleaning up the approach, right? You might actually need to take a look at how you have framed the significance and innovation of your grant proposal as it relates to the scientific merit, right? So again, you might need to bolster some of your arguments around, again, how you arrived at this question in the first place. What exactly makes this innovative? How is it sort of improving upon what we already know? How is it moving the field forward? You might need to do some work there. Again, those are typically pretty obvious based on the critiques that you get from your reviewers. Third step is to look more closely at grantsmanship. And this can happen in a variety of different areas. But the main ones that you need to focus on are where you can better clarify and justify your decision. So again, if we go back to step number one, point number one around, do you agree, do you disagree with the critiques? In those areas where you disagree, you will get some really good information about why you disagree, why you are doing things the way that you're doing them. And that's what really needs to show up and in a way that is more clear in your resubmission. So identify where those are and make sure that you're addressing that as best you can when it comes to the grantsmanship aspect of your resubmission. Next is, where can you make sure that you framed your argument in a way that has resonated with your reviewers, right? This is about making sure that you are strategically aligned with your reviewers. And again, if you're in a position where your application is scored but not fundable, chances are you've already done a pretty good job of this. You just need to take it to the next level. And the way that we talk about it is, your reviewers like your proposal, but they just don't love it. So how can you make sure that they love it? And part of the way that you do that is by making sure that you are speaking directly to them and what they care about in terms of, the study section that you are finding yourself in and what the subject matter expertise is of that study section. So how can you make sure that the way that you framed your application is most relevant to the subject matter experts who are going to be reviewing and discussing your application? Next is, where can you make your grant proposal easier and clearer for your reviewers to read? This one is absolutely crucial when it comes to grantsmanship. You want it to be as simple and easy as possible for your reviewers to grasp what it is that you are trying to accomplish. And one of the best ways to do that is to put yourself in your reviewer's shoes and imagine what it's like to read not only your application, but a dozen others in a fairly short period of time and provide useful and meaningful critiques and comments on it, right? So one of the ways you can really kind of get on your reviewer's side in that context is to make it as easy as possible for them to read and grasp what it is that you're doing. And what that really comes down to is connecting the dots for them, not making any assumptions, not making them work too hard to figure out what it is that you're trying to do. You can think about this in terms of, spoon feeding maybe, or handing it to them kind of on a silver platter. But the idea is that you are serving them. You're making it as easy as possible for your reviewers to read your application and to not have to think too hard as they're sort of deciphering what it is that you're doing. Of course, there is thinking involved, right? Because they do have to come up with meaningful recommendations and critiques, but you want them to focus on thinking hard in that aspect of the review, not in reading your application. right? So there's a key difference there. And the more that you can do to take some of that burden, take some of that effort away from your reviewers in the initial read of your application, the better off you're going to be. The other way to address grantsmanship is how can you find ways to highlight aspects of your proposal that can generate excitement among your reviewers and create advocates for your proposal, right? So remember that the difference between a grant that reviewers like and that reviewers love is that enthusiasm for your idea and the potential that that idea has to advance the field. And so, again, this is about aligning your project with the interests of the subject matter experts who make up your study section, right? And finding ways to describe how this is going to advance the field and what the real impact, the potential impact of this research is. And of course, you don't want to oversell the implications and the impact of your research, but you do want to be clear and honest about that and to not hold back your own enthusiasm about what the potential is, right? So some of that comes through in the style of your writing, but honestly, a lot of it just comes through reminding yourself why you're doing this research in the first place and letting that sort of be the basis of the writing that you do in that section of the application. Really reminding yourself why you're doing this research and what the potential of it is. And so if you're writing from a place of enthusiasm and excitement about your research, that translates into the application itself. And I know that sounds kind of strange and maybe a bit woo-woo, but trust me, I've read hundreds and hundreds of grant applications at this point, and I can tell when the PI is enthusiastic about the work and when they're not. So bringing that enthusiasm to your writing allows it to come through in the application itself, and that enthusiasm is contagious, right? And so that is a huge part of moving your grant from that sort of scored but not fundable place to getting a fundable score the next time around. So to recap, those three sort of broad steps that you need to accomplish to get your R01 resubmission from scored to fundable is first to do a deep dive in your summary statement and really make sure that you understand what your reviewers are asking for, both in terms of the obvious critiques and the not so obvious critiques. Next, you need to make sure that you are fully addressing the critiques of the scientific merit of your application. And next, you want to make sure that you are fully addressing the critiques of the grantsmanship, which again, those ones are typically less obvious. And that is usually what we end up helping our PIs with the most, is sort of deciphering and then addressing those grantsmanship issues. So if you have an R01 or R01 equivalent grant that is scored but not quite in the fundable range, and you want to be absolutely sure that your grant gets a fundable score on resubmission, please get in touch with us. That is what we do inside our strategic grant review service. We have an 80% funding success rate on resubmission with our PIs who go through this process with us. So we know what we're doing. We're very good at it, and we would be absolutely delighted to help you get your R01 resubmission funded. So if you are interested in learning more and in working with us, you can apply in the link that is in the video description. So we'd love to hear from you, and we will see you next time.